Today's session is how to go from zero to hero with your grant strategy. Emily's going to do a little quick introduction before we jump right into today's session.
Right. So you are, we're joining you here today from Elevation, and we're very glad to have our guest speaker from Instrumentl. So a little bit about me. My name is Emily. I'm the Communications and Partnerships and general kind of marketing manager at Elevation. I'm really passionate about community building and also really interested in behavioral psychology. I'm also a nonprofit board member myself. I'm on the board for Yale Women. So I love joining you today and being here, and it's really exciting to kind of bring together all these diverse interests in creating content that's meaningful for nonprofits and helpful to them. A little bit about Elevation. Most people are familiar with us, but just in case you're new to us today, we are a full-service digital agency that is dedicated to helping nonprofits increase their impact. We do web and graphic design, website support, branding, SEO, social media. And then our guest speaker today is Will. Will Yang is from Instrumentl, and he's head of growth over there. Instrumentl is a platform that brings together all sorts of different activities related to grant research. So everything from research to organizing to submitting, keeping track of deadlines. And so he has a lot of experience working with a lot of grant managers. And so he'll be joining us today and giving some great tips from these years of experience working with different grant professionals. So we're very excited to have him join us today. And just a few housekeeping items, which I nearly forgot. So feel free to include questions in the chat. There will be more opportunities to also, have a more interactive session as we go along. We'd love to know a little bit more about your biggest challenge related to grants, or something about your nonprofit's mission or latest initiative. Just kind of share a little bit about what you're working on. And this session is being recorded, so we will share the slides and the recording after. So if there's anything you want to refer back to, that will be made available to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that kickoff, Emily. As Emily mentioned, if you haven't already shared where you're coming in from, what organization you're part of, what you do there, it'd be great to hear from you. It'd also be good to hear what some of the things you're working on related to grants are. I will preface and say this workshop, in terms of the educational content, is helpful for any nonprofit, but in terms of the interactive component, that is going to be mostly focused on organizations with 501c3 status, as well as at least 90K in operating revenue. That's not to say you might not necessarily still get value out of that second portion, but I just want to give that disclaimer ahead of time, because some of the systems and processes we're going to go over are more applicable to folks who have more established grant programs than folks that might just be in the very early stages of their grant journey. As Emily mentioned, my name is Will, and every other week I essentially host grant workshops with expert grant educators who are best-selling authors to books like Grant Writing for Dummies, as well as How to Write a Grant, the Grant Unicorn Method. And pretty much I'm part of Instrumentl, which helps over 1,500 nonprofits in finding, tracking, and managing their grants. So every day I'm listening to some of the challenges that nonprofits often have to face with their grant seeking goals. So Emily's going to launch a poll now in terms of just wondering from everybody, what do you find most challenging about grants? This will give me some helpful context as to what to focus more on in today's presentation. This is a very interactive workshop and whatnot, and so I want to make sure that we are speaking to the things that you guys are going to find most valuable. So go ahead and take a moment, enter in that respective poll. And then Emily, whenever you feel like the bulk of the room has answered, you can go ahead and share those results and go from there.
Perfect. I do see responses still coming in. About half of our audience has responded. So we'll give folks another second and then share those responses. So again, that was staying organized with deadlines. We had finding time to work on applications, getting selected or winning the grants that you apply to, or locating good fit funders. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share those results. So there we go. We see that most people have their greatest challenge is locating the good fit funders. A lot of you also, shared that it's challenging to be selected by the grants that you do apply to. And it looks like staying organized with deadlines and finding time to work on applications is a little bit less of a priority. Oops, I apologize. It should now be visible to everyone.
And this pretty much resonates with me as well. I run this workshop pretty much every week or so, and I can tell you guys that more than half of the audience almost always says finding good fit funders is a difficulty. And so fortunately, you guys are in the right room. Elevation Web has curated this great series, and by the end of today's workshop, if you stick with me, we will have an interactive component where every single one of you that wants to set up a custom grant search for your organization will be able to do so and get those good fit funders that could be good for you. So at this point, you probably have some thoughts that might resonate with you here. For example, one thing that you might think about is you might often feel ill-prepared around your organization's ability to consistently find good fit funders and apply for grants. We saw that over 50% of you guys fell into that category. I also saw that there was a good portion of people that were struggling in terms of deadlines and the number of things that you have to do when it comes to grants. And there's also some of you that I know are in the audience that are actual grant writers, development directors that are in the process, and you might often feel writer's block in which you've actually carved the time to write that grant, but you open up Microsoft Word and you got a blank screen because it's just hard to get going there. And so you probably think to yourself, are grants worth it? And the answer to that question is absolutely yes. And the reason why is because there's actually over 87,000 grant-making foundations in the United States alone. And on just Instrumentl, we have over 11,000 active grants that are seeking nonprofit organizations to fund. And so we're adding about 100 every single week. And what that should tell you is that as opposed to thinking about grants as a zero-sum game or a scarcity game, it's actually one in which you can approach it from an abundance mindset and really think about all these different opportunities that might be out there for your organization. And when you do that, this doesn't have to be you. So this year, 49% of nonprofit employees have expected cost cuts. 54% of nonprofit leaders have implemented changes already to their organizational goals and activities. And there are estimates of between 11% to 38% of nonprofits that might close in the long term from COVID-19 impact. And so that leads us to our agenda for today. Today, we are going to dig into first, why are grants so powerful? What makes them so effective as a source of funding? What is prospect research? We're going to actually give you 16 questions that you can help you in evaluating good fit funders. We'll also talk about how to prepare your organization for grant success, 5 steps that you can take there. And then, like I said, we're going to have that interactive component where we're going to start actually finding good fit funders with Instrumentl. Again, for the folks that just entered the room, since I saw a few new folks coming in, for that side of things, we're going to be actually setting up searches, and that'll be really helpful for folks with 501c3 status, as well as at least 90K in operating revenue. And if you stick with me until the end, I have 2 free bonuses for everybody that attended live today. It'll just be additional resources that will be able to supplement this presentation. That way you can take what you learned today and really hit the ground running and go from 0 to hero, like we said in the title of this presentation. So let's first dig into why grants are so powerful. The reason why grants are so powerful at the high level is because there's a broad range of funding possibilities for grants. So you can pretty much find a grant to fund most things under the sun at a nonprofit, whether that's education outreach, project program, general operating expenses, capital projects, or training and capacity building. And as you guys read through these bullet points, what I want you guys to think about is I want you to think about for your organization, what are 1 or 2 of the funding opportunities that you would want to seek funding for? And I want you to store that in the back of your head, because we're going to use that answer in a little bit when we dig into that interactive component of what sort of grants we want to set up our searches for. So right now, take a screenshot. Imagine you had, a virtual camera of sorts, and you can just tell me, think about what you would actually say for later. And then we're going to keep on going and learning why grants are so powerful. More reasons why grants are so powerful is because foundations actually have to give every single year. There is a rule that is known as the minimum distribution rule, which means that foundations have to give 5% of their average market value of their net investment assets. And if any of you guys have been tracking the overall stock market since early COVID, it's been on an absolute tear. And so as a result, what that means is that these private foundations have more money to give that they have to give every single year as a result of their assets growing as well. So the bulk of these distributions will come out in the form of grants. And just to show you an example of how much money we might be talking about, here I've pulled an example of the New York Community Trust. And this is an example 990 report profile on Instrumentl. And what you can see is that in this situation, what I've taken is the total assets of that firm, and I've essentially multiplied that by 0.05, which represents 5%. And when I do that, I'm able to see that the New York Community Trust is likely going to be giving, on average, at least $146 million. And if you look at the number to the right of the number that is in the box, you'll see that they actually gave $173 million. So whenever you're thinking about doing some back of the envelope math, or you just want a quick and easy hack for how to think about how much money might be available from a funder, a good beginner or intermediate tip is just to look at their total assets, multiply that by 0.05, and that will give you what the potential funding pool will look like for that year. Other reasons why grants are so powerful is because many foundations are consistent in their giving. In fact, they like to sustain impact and they will keep funding you as long as you are demonstrating that you're a good steward of capital. That's why we often tell folks that if you're part of a new nonprofit and you're just establishing yourself, grants are probably not the place you want to invest your efforts. And the reason why is because you are not yet sustainable. You want to focus on grants when you have your feet under you and you are ready to really demonstrate to an organization that you're ready to scale some sort of program or impact you're working on. You're going to find it very hard if you're a newer organization looking for grants to find grants for new nonprofits, just because these foundations are stewards of other people's capital. And so what they need to think about is, how are the dollars that I'm allocating to these different local communities going to be used? And can I count on you and your nonprofit to be around the next year when the next funding cycle opens up? Other reasons why grants are so powerful is because grants can be systemized. If you've ever applied for a grant, you know that there are some core steps that you can always count on when it comes to the grant preparation, the actual proposal submission, as well as the reporting requirements. And then lastly, grants can help you with organizational accountability. And this is a really good point for why you want to invest in grants, is because it means more feedback loops for your organization. If your organization finds it difficult in terms of consistently measuring its outcomes, then it might benefit from applying to more grants, because those grants are going to have reporting requirements that will force those feedback loops for your organization in terms of delivering and measuring your impact. So now that we've understood why grants are so powerful, let's transition to talk about what is prospect research for folks that may not exactly know what that means when people are talking about that. And then from there, dig into why it is important. So prospect research is the process of finding, assessing, and qualifying public, private, and corporate foundations to pursue more strategic and planned giving. So on the right side of your screen here, you see a grant lifecycle chart. And essentially, this is what every grant will go through in terms of their typical cycle. And what we're talking about in the context of prospect research is that bottom right corner that says, find your funding. And like over 50% of you guys mentioned, finding funding, at least good fit funders, is really hard, but we'll make that a lot easier by the end of today's session. The important thing to remember, though, in the context of prospect research, is that virtually every nonprofit has high capacity donors hiding in plain sight. In fact, a whopping 40% of donors in a recent study admitted that they could give more than they currently are. So what our job is as fundraisers is to identify those prospects so we can move them up to greater levels of giving. So the story I like to tell here is, a few months ago during one of my regular grant workshops, an attendee was telling me about how she'd been volunteering for this organization for probably the last 5 years or so. And what she realized when she tried Instrumentl was she realized that that when she looked up that organization she'd been volunteering for, they actually had a grant making side of the organization that she had no idea about. And so she had been part of this nonprofit that she had been volunteering time with, and she hadn't even realized that she had a funding opportunity with an organization she had regular communications with. And it was literally just taking some time to schedule time with the director of that organization she was a part of, that they were able to get on the short list for the next funding cycle and then secure funding from that organization she had been connected to. And so that's a perfect example of a lot of times when you are starting out and scaling out your grant process as well as your prospects, they will come from just your backyard. They're going to be organizations you're already familiar with, but you may or may not be aware that they have these grant functions. And there's a lot of information when you are digging into prospect research, but I want to tell you just some of the important information that you will find useful when answering that question of what makes a good fit funder. Some of the information you'll be able to find are key stats on assets and giving patterns. And the reason why that's going to be really helpful is because if you can understand the general directional trend of a funder, you can decide whether or not it's worth your while to pursue that opportunity. If, for example, a funder has been reducing how much they've been giving in grants over the last 3 years, then maybe you should deprioritize that funder versus another funder where they have been drastically increasing the amount of funding they're giving through their grants program. Similarly, you're going to be able to find information on names of key individuals. And the reason why that's valuable is because if you have the names of key individuals, you can do exactly what my attendee did in terms of reverse searching and identifying organizations you might already have existing relationships with. A lot of times you guys have different board of directors, and those board of directors are going to be sitting on multiple boards of nonprofits. And so that can be a great channel for you when it comes to identifying some relationships that you can either start to build or some already existing relationships you weren't aware of. You can also check out things like the list of past grantees and funded projects. And the reason why that's helpful when you're trying to identify good fit funders is because if, for example, you're that food bank in the chat I saw earlier and you're looking for other sources of funding, well, you would probably want to seek the funders who have been funding other food shelter or food bank related projects, as opposed to the funder that's been funding all education projects. You want to look for overall alignment in terms of what the funder likes to fund, because that's what's going to pique their interest when your proposal comes into their inbox. And then you also want to check out things like geographic areas of focus, as well as overall grant eligibility requirements. It's obviously very important that you're applying for grants that you can actually stand a good chance of winning. And that's oftentimes one of the most beginner mistakes that people make, is they'll apply for a grant they never stood a chance for in the first place. So what that might look like when you are looking at a 990 report is something like this on Instrumentl, in which you're going to see the information about the total assets and giving. You're going to see the contact information, key people, and you also see other key stats and things like that. We'll dig more into this in a little bit, but what Instrumentl will do that makes it a lot easier to parse this data on is it's going to give you insights about the funders that you might struggle to find on your own. For example, what's the difference between new grantees and repeat grantees? Do new grantees get more money or less money? And what does that look like in terms of magnitude? So there's really 16 questions that I think are helpful when you're trying to evaluate funders. And I'm going to dig into each of these 16. Don't worry if you feel like it's going really fast. I have a freebie at the end that's going to recap all of these questions as well, and it's going to break it down into a longer guide. So in the case where what I want you to think about as we go through these questions are just, are you asking all of these questions? If not, what could you introduce to your existing process? And then from there, keep these in mind as we will later get into the interactive components and we ask these same questions in evaluating funders. So the first things I want to go over are RFP questions that you can go over when you're assessing good fits. So when you're applying for grants, you're generally going to have a grant RFP, which is going to detail all of the information about that opportunity. And what I want you to ask yourself are questions like, what is the grant maker's mission? Does it align with your initiatives? So perfect example, that food bank, if you have a funder that's talking about how food security is a really important cause area of theirs, then you have alignment. And then you also want to look at what the specific goals are for the grant RFP, as well as what are the eligibility requirements? Do they require that you are in the state of Wisconsin and you are not in the state of Wisconsin, right? And also, what are the sizes of the grants being made? In the case where you are working towards a fundraising goal of 50 grand and the opportunity is going to be for $1 grand, maybe you want to deprioritize that $1 grand process, as opposed to looking at other opportunities that are $5,000 or $10,000 that get you closer to your goal with less direct effort, right? And then lastly, what type of grant is this opportunity for? That's going to be important when going back to that earlier slide when you thought about what sort of broad funding possibilities or opportunities you want to pursue in terms of your grants. Other questions you want to ask relate to the giving median questions. So you're going to want to look into what the median grant size is for this funder. Again, alignment to your actual project initiative goals is oftentimes a good way or a good proxy for you to estimate the prioritization of where that grant should be in your grant pipeline. If you have a fundraising goal of $100,000 and you've got the opportunity to spend the next 2 weeks working on the opportunity that's going to either get you a $20K grant or the other one that's going to get you a $5K grant, you have to weigh the pros and cons of either or. There's no right or wrong answer, but maybe you realize the $5K grant, I can actually crank it out in the next half week and leaving me the other week and a half for the $20K grant. Or maybe you decide actually the $20K grant is really well aligned and our time would be better spent there because it's going to get us to that 20% point of our overall fundraising goal. And lastly, how has that median grant amount changed over the last 3 years? Is it going up? Is it going down? Is it staying steady? Those are important questions to ask because what you should be thinking about as a grant seeker is how sustainable is it for us to expect that we'll be able to renew this funding as well. In the case where you're applying for a grant where you won't be able to renew it, well, the challenge for you is going to be that come next year when you have the same core needs in terms of expenses and things like that to fund, you're going to have to find a new good fit funder in the case where that is not a sustainable source of funding. All right.
We already
Next
have
question.
a question from the audience. Well, so Christopher Werner is wondering, when you're researching funders, should you be paying attention to, or is there a way to understand whether they really find different certifications to be important and valuable? So his specific question was,
Sure.
about gold star rating, and if that's important to funders. But I think a lot of people in the audience probably have a similar question. There are various different certifications you can get. So how important is that to funders? And is there a way to see, based on the organization, what kind of, when you're looking at that funder profile, is there a way to see what sorts of certifications are of interest or important to them?
I think the best way to approach that, because funders are so unique, is to simply send a message out to them and see whether or not those are important to their evaluation criteria. What you will also find is that funders will often reveal what their evaluation criteria are, and you'll be able to dig into specifically what they're going to be assessing your organization on. That said, what I will tell you is that I have rarely seen like those certifications as the deal makers or the deal breakers of a grant proposal. Typically speaking, it's actually going to be from the overall quality and alignment of your proposal to the funder's interests. And so a lot of times you should be focusing more so on the impact that you're leaving on your community through your programs and projects than necessarily pursuing a certification process on the hopes that that's going to make you even more attractive and whatnot. What a lot of these funders are looking for is they're looking for ways to clearly demonstrate that impact is being made and that when they are distributing their grant dollars, that they can count on you to deliver on what your proposal is saying. That is probably number one above anything else in terms of the process itself. So what I'd say is it can be helpful. And if your organization already has those things, awesome. Feel free to definitely highlight that. It's always great to brag a little bit in terms of your accomplishments and whatnot. But at the same time, it's never going to be the thing that is the key evaluation criteria unless that funder has specifically stated that in the way that they're assessing the applicants, that it is a top priority or area of focus for them. And then if you have any other questions, we'll definitely be able to dig into those a little bit later as well. We do have a lot of content as well, so I want to make sure we can get through that without cutting off and whatnot. But feel free to keep chatting in those questions. We'll lightning round those questions later on as well. So other questions that you're going to want to ask are 6 funder giving history questions. So these are actually, in my opinion, going, related to the question that we just got, these are actually even more helpful for you to also be able to look into when you're doing your research on funders. So I like to tell folks to see if they can identify at least 3 previously funded organizations similar to theirs. That's going to make sure that you actually have alignment in terms of what you're working on and what the funder wants to work on. Secondly, is your organization's geographic location represented historically? If you're based out of Florida and you noticed when you actually go through the 990 report and you see all the past grantees and they're all coming from California or the Pacific Northwest, then it's probably not a good fit funder of all the opportunities out there for you. So you want to make sure there's actually a focus in terms of a geographic focus here. You also want to look at the percentage of new grantees versus repeat grantees. Now, there isn't an easy way to do this when you're digging through pages and pages of 990s, but I'll show you a faster way to do that when we are setting up our free accounts in Instrumentl. But the reason why that's helpful is because if you can identify a funder that is funding around 30% or more of new grantees, it means they are generally very receptive to establishing new relationships with different organizations. And so that can be your foot in the door because it signals that actually it's not impossible to start establishing a relationship with this funder. It's a good use of my time, as opposed to maybe the funder where only 10% of their grantees every single year are new grantees. In that situation, it is more likely that that sort of funder in the second scenario is more so taking a cherry picking approach and not necessarily as open to net new, folks that are applying for their opportunity. And then you also want to look at things like the median grant amounts for new grantees aligning well to your project budget, as well as if your organization's impact areas align with the funder's 3-year historical giving trends. Okay, so we're going to dig into exactly how you can look at that at a high level in a really fast way. But of course, you will always be able to dig into the IRS 990 reports to go at this more diligently in the case where you have that time. But again, I'm going to show you faster ways to do that later on, so don't worry about that. And then the last questions that I like to ask when it comes to evaluating good fit funders are internal consideration questions. I tell folks that they always forget this side of things because they're so focused on trying to find good fit funders that they forget about thinking about their own organization and what their organization can do. So questions that you can ask yourself are things like, does your nonprofit even have bandwidth to take on this application? Taking a step back from all the opportunities out there, just taking a second to pause, go through the actual application requirements and see if you're going to be able to meet the requirements for not only the submission deadline, but also later on if you were to receive the grant and have to do the reporting guidelines. You will need to make sure that you have the bandwidth to support that. Similarly, does this RFP have parts where your nonprofit can repurpose past grant proposals? Sometimes you can plug and play different portions of past grant proposals. And so in the case where you see a similar question being asked by 3 different opportunities, then maybe you want to bucket those 3 together in terms of the timeline that you're going to be working on them, because you'll be able to kind of wordsmith a few small tweaks to cater more directly to each of the 3 funders, but you'll be able to really tackle, 3 birds with 1 stone, as opposed to tackling it one by one and by one and so on. And so it's really important that you think about where you're at in your organization for bandwidth. If you have no time to be writing grants, then that's something where you have to think about, in terms of your overall organization's fundraising efforts, where should you go instead right now, as opposed to focusing your time on grants? Whereas if it is a good time to think about 2022 and grants, then you want to think about exactly who you're going to have on deck. So are you going to have a few interns to help you? Are you going to have some volunteers? Are you going to have contractors? Are you going to bring in a consultancy or a grant writer? Is it all going to be in-house? Who exactly is owning what? Everybody has to be involved in this sort of collaborative process, because if you can't support it, then it's not going to be a sustainable source of funding. So now I want to dig into 5 steps on how to prepare for grants. And then we're going to take a little pause and start setting people up, and then we'll do the interactive component. But when I dig into this section, I like to pull in this quote from Atomic Habits. If you've read this book, I'd love to hear from you in the chat. I think it's a great reminder of different things and whatnot. But the quote from this book is, you do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. Your goal is your desired outcome, whereas your system is the collection of daily habits that will get you there. So this year, spend less time focusing on outcomes and more time focusing on the habits that precede the results. So I think a lot of times when people in the nonprofit space think about grants, they think about grants from sort of a Hail Mary approach where they're up against a wall and they have a funding goal and they just think that grants are going to be the saving grace for them. And from there, they're like, we're going to raise 100K in grants. And if you actually were to ask them, how much did you raise in grants last year? They're going to tell you they raised nothing from grants. Going from 0 to 100 is unfortunately not super realistic unless you're coming in with a ton of expertise. But what's more realistic is for you to think about, this year, we maybe applied for, 3 grants and we didn't win any. So next year, our goal is going to apply to 10 grants and win our first grant, right? And so really thinking about now from that goal, how can we get to the point where we are applying to a grant every other month or so, right? And so thinking about the actual things we can control can focus us in on the system as opposed to just the outcome. The outcomes come as a result of the system being in place. And if you don't have a system in place, then that's something that you need to focus on first for your organization. And this same quote can apply for different other areas of fundraising when it comes to nonprofits as well. You can't expect that you're going to get a lot of individual donors if you don't have a steady stream of different opportunities for those donors to engage with your nonprofit, different ways for them to hear from you, et cetera. And so it's really important that you really focus on the process and what you're going to be putting in place to set yourself up for success here. So the first step that I like to tell people to focus on is to make sure that you're actually discoverable. So is it clear within a minute of visiting your website what your mission is and how will you measure impact? Elevation Web does a great job in terms of helping out with some of this side of the messaging, but essentially you want to make sure that it is really easy to find detailed case studies along with contact information. Is it clear what your impact is on your community? I have interviewed a number of different community foundations, and they all say the same thing in terms of the program officers. What they're looking for is clear measurements of impact on your local community. So if you cannot give some sort of clear quantitative number, it is time for you to focus some time in figuring out ways to measure that in some sort of form. It doesn't have to be exact science. Many times the foundations have told me that they're just looking for effort in this space of measuring impact. They're not even looking for the exact pinpoint, but they are looking for you having a general idea of the impressions and the sustaining impact that you're leaving on your community. The second step you can take is you can ask your board or for your community's help. So referrals are often the lowest hanging fruit for finding prospects, especially in the world of grants at the local level. And what I like to tell folks is, it's always good to start at the local opportunities. Then you're going to kind of graduate to the regional opportunities. And then that's when you're then going to graduate to the national opportunities. It is not helpful for you to think to yourself today, I'm ready for grants. Let's go look at what the Cliff Bar, Foundation is doing at a national level or something like that. It is not a realistic goal. It is not something in which it's going to be helpful for your organization in setting themselves up for success. And the reason why is because, again, you don't have enough of the system and the understanding of how a grant process goes at that point in order for you to be ready for that big major league play, so to speak. And so just like how baseball players spend years in the minor leagues before hitting the majors, I always recommend you start at the local and the regional level before you go and move on to the national level. I also want you to think about how you can consider fielding requests for introductions from your board, staff, volunteers, and community. Obviously, we are going to have different ways that you can identify good fit funders. But I want you to think about is, how can I curate a list of 10 to 15 local or regional organizations that are funding different nonprofits in the area, and then solicit whether or not someone has an existing relationship. A lot of times you will have those relationships in place. It's just a matter of asking. All right. And then the next thing you're going to want to ask or dig into in terms of steps is strategically outline your funding strategy. So this is going to be something that's going to take a couple hours, but what I want you to do is, if you are the key decision maker, which I know a few of you guys are, you guys mentioned your executive directors, but in a few other ones, you guys mentioned that you're team members. What I want you to do is I want you to get the team in the same place. You're at December 7th right now. You've got a couple weeks ahead of 2022. If you haven't already done this, you're going to want to start asking these questions and getting answers to them. Firstly, what are your biggest resource needs? What programs need to be funded more than others? And how does that shake out in terms of your goals and priorities? Next, what are you going to do in terms of tracking how things are going? So if it's going to be the end of March, the end of July, the end of September, so in other words, when we're starting to get towards the end of every quarter or so, how are you going to actually track towards the goals of what you want your priorities to be? And then what sort of outcomes will you be able to report? And then lastly, how or when will you be able to report these outcomes? So what that might look like if you're in a team meeting is, it might look like something like this, where you have a table, you got your fundraising sources on the left-hand side. That's going to detail things like foundation grants, federal grants, corporate grants, major donors, in-person events, online fundraising. And then you're going to have something like 2021, how much you raised. And then you're going to have a baseline goal for 2022. And then what I want you to do is take whatever your baseline goal is and multiply that by another 20% or 30% and set that to be your stretch goal. And then from there, the last thing I want you to do is I want you to look at your eligible projects. And from there, map out what your nonprofit is investing all of its bandwidth towards into the respective areas where you think the funding will align with that respective project. There are other ways you can do this. I'm sure some of you already have existing processes, but in the case where you are just starting out or you're just getting your feet under you in terms of planning for 2022, this can be a great beginner's Kickstarter guide to getting everything in place and getting your thoughts mapped out. And from here, your team will then have a single document that you can kind of use as your North Star. That way, whenever somebody on the team is like, well, we had this new idea, you can pin it back to the strategic priorities and say, well, does this align to our overall plan of what we talked about in our December meeting before we headed into 2022 and whatnot. The fourth step you can take when it comes to preparing for grants is to think about your programs in projects. All right. So projects are temporary initiatives with a clear beginning and end that lead to a specific outcome, whereas programs are ongoing efforts that typically include projects. So these will often fulfill your nonprofit's mission. And the example I like to pull from is every single Monday, I tutor a sixth grader through a local nonprofit that essentially provides one-to-one tutoring services for different at-risk youths. And essentially the problem they often face is getting sufficient funding for general operating expenses. I'm sure a lot of you guys can relate to that. General operating expenses is always something that you want to find funding for. And so the solution that that organization could have is to position from the perspective of a project with clear goals. So here are two ways that you might be able to position your program as a project. Instead of just saying that you have a tutoring program, you could say that one of your goals is to double the capacity of weekly online tutoring programs that has a clear measured output as to what success will look like. Or you might have something like, you have a reading drive where you want to gift a book to a kid twice a year. The reason why we are thinking about how we take something from just a weekly tutoring program to something more concrete to exactly having a beginning, middle, and end. And the reason why that's so important is because, again, it goes back to what we've talked about in today's presentation, in that what funders are looking for is they're looking for signal from you that you are a trustworthy steward of capital, and that when we give you X dollars, that you are going to deliver on that and be able to measure and track your outcomes. So when you're able to say something like, hey, next year when the funding cycle reopens, we doubled our capacity for weekly online tutoring programs. It is way easier for me as a grant maker to say, hey, Will, you doubled your capacity of weekly online tutoring programs. So why don't we continue growing that? In fact, we'll give you double the amount you asked for last year. So let's try and double it again, right? And so by thinking about your programs in little chunks or segments and projects, it makes things a lot more crystal clear for the opportunities that you're pursuing to understand exactly how you're going to use that money. And I think Sylvia's saying, I've done this end around from for general operating funds and it works. So exactly, that's great to hear. And it works time and time again. And so if you have been struggling in terms of getting funding, a lot of times the feedback, if you were to ask the funder for feedback, is going to be, you guys weren't specific enough. It was not clear for us to understand exactly how are you going to use the 20K you were requesting? How are we going to measure success, right? And so that is really important. The fifth step that you can take when it comes to preparing for grants is to create a weighted decision matrix. So this is going to be kind of an extension of the earlier idea of getting everybody on the same page in your team. What I want you to think about things like an alignment of opportunities, areas of interest, number of past grantees, award amounts, estimated time to complete the proposal, competition, as well as existing relationships. In other words, in simple terms, what a decision matrix is it's just a model that you can consistently use to determine whether or not you want to pursue a grant. And one of my freebies for today's workshop is I'm going to give you the Instrumentl way of like how we approach these decision matrices. But essentially what you're going to be able to answer are questions of yes, no, it meets this criteria, it doesn't meet this criteria, and then be able to have a concrete answer each time when you come up across a new grant opportunity to see whether or not it is worth pursuing. So weighted decision matrices should be created in a way where it works for your organization. Every single organization is going to have a different model that they're going to want to use because every organization is different. But what you want to think about is if I thought about what the top 5 or 7 factors are when it comes to pursuing a grant opportunity are, that I can run through the last 10 grants I've applied for and consistently all the grants that I applied for are actually ones that would have been opportunities I should have pursued, right? If you're ever coming across a situation where you run through the last 10 opportunities that you've applied for through your weighted decision matrix and half of them are coming back like you shouldn't have applied to them, then it means that your organization needs to take a step back, think a little bit more strategically, and reprioritize what you're working on in terms of your grant strategy. So weighted decision matrices can be super helpful, especially when it comes to if your organization has ever struggled with indecisiveness in terms of which opportunities to pursue, if they've struggled in general in terms of evaluating criterias for different grant opportunities. Just by putting it out there and creating a rubric for yourself, it can be useful to determine whether or not you should pursue or not pursue an opportunity. So we've gone over a lot so far. Now we're going to dig into how to find good fit funders. Like we went over earlier in the poll, it looked like over half of you guys are struggling with this. And so hopefully I will be able to solve that challenge as well for you guys. So the easiest way to find good fit funders is with Instrumentl. However, there are alternatives that I wanted to share as well. There are alternatives like Google, ProPublica, Listservs, Charity Navigator, GuideStar, and Foundation Directory Online. In the case where you have a local library and whatnot, you can check that resource out and whatnot. But there's really 7 reasons why Instrumentl is the easiest to use. The first reason is because we are built specifically for grant prospecting, tracking, and management, and bringing it all into one place. So a lot of grant tools out there only cover one side of the problem, but we are the institutional fundraising platform. We essentially take you from end to end in terms of when you discover the grant, when you track it, and then actually manage the reward itself. And then you'll also see that we include active public and private funding sources for 501c3s, and we have detailed 990 reports and foundation reports at your fingertips. So a lot of the questions we've asked today in terms of what makes a good fit funder, they're made much easier to make a decision on in Instrumentl because we essentially do all the data analysis for you. So you don't have to, for example, pull up the calculator and say, well, we have X number of grantees and X number of new grantees, and so the percentage of new grantees is X, Y, Z. Instead, Instrumentl just does that for you. What's really cool, though, is that everyone's going to experience in just a little bit, in like 10 minutes or so, the unique matching algorithm. And the reason why that's really powerful is because each of you guys are going to be able to create a project on Instrumentl, and Instrumentl is going to think for you and then output for you a curated list of opportunities that are good fit funders for your nonprofit. So you might be used to having to use tools where you have to sift through all the results and sift out the ones that are not good fits. But Instrumentl is going to think about where your organization is, what you're funding for, and what grant sizes you're looking for, and essentially output for you a short list to reduce some of that cognitive work for you. And then you're going to be able to also take care of deadlines. We automatically track those for you. And then we also make collaboration across your team really easy. So in the case where you're one of the executive directors in the room today, if you've ever struggled with getting everybody on the same page about that one grant proposal application, you don't have to struggle with that on Instrumentl because you can essentially just create tasks and notes and documents stored all in the same place. So what we see is that folks on average save 3 hours a week and increase grant application by 78%. And that's just because of some of the efficiency gains that people have when they bring their work into Instrumentl. So I'm going to dig into Instrumentl in just a little bit, but in case you want to know who we typically help, we help grant writers and consultants, grant writing teams, development teams, executive directors, development and fundraising directors, pretty much any nonprofit that is looking to scale their strategy and efforts. And so pretty much what I say is 501c3 status and at least 90K in operating revenue, because it means that you are ready and in a place where you're an attractive opportunity for funders. So when you are finding good fit funders, you're going to want to use a decision matrix to evaluate your fit, consider your competitiveness, and then connect with past applicants and contact the funder with questions. Definitely contact them with questions. They are used to people not contacting them with questions. I conducted a series of interviews 2 months ago with a ton of foundations, and literally the number one piece of advice that was the most common piece of advice was, we wish that people would read the instructions and ask us questions. And so it is something that is so simple that we all forget about because we get so stressed about the applications. And then also we'll be sharing other trainings and more in-depth topics in terms of other grant related things in the workshop replay and whatnot. What I want to do is I want to set everybody up with good fit funders and 3 simple steps. We're going to dig into Instrumentl and walk through exactly what we're going to be setting up in terms of the projects. That way, everybody can also leave today's workshop with personalized grant recommendations. And so what I want folks to do is go into the chat right now, go ahead and click that link and then follow along with me as I share my screen. I try not to go too far ahead, but essentially you're going to get into this page. And this is where I just want you to use the special link. And then when you're ready, fill in the information and click the next button. And then let me know when you're there and then wait for instructions from there. So I'm going to show it on my screen as well. But essentially what you're going to land on is a page like this. And from here, you're going to want to fill in your information. And then once you have done so, click the next button. And then you are going to then see that you can book a time for later on. When you get to that point, just book a time later in the week. That way you can get time with our team. We have essentially free support for you, in which what you'll be able to do is you'll be able to review the project that we were about to set up together, and then make sure that your project is set up for success. And then also ask questions about your grant strategy and get feedback for what you guys might be working on. So when you do that, you're going to do something like this, where you're on this page, you're going to fill this in, click the next button, and then book that time. And then when you're at that point, throw me a thumbs. I don't know if folks can do a thumbs up here, but you can also do it in the chat. That way I just know where folks are at. I usually give 3 to 4 minutes or so for folks to fill this out from here. And then everybody will then have their own accounts. And then when you're logged in, you're going to end up somewhere close to, on my screen, you're going to end up something like this, in which you'll know that you're in the right place if you've booked that time, and then you are now in the first step of project overview. So just to show it for folks, I'm going to create an account as well with you guys today. That way I can follow along. And if you're having any difficulties as well, just feel free to chat it in. But essentially, I'm just filling this out for folks, Elevation Web webinar. And then from here, I'm gonna click the next button. So when you click that next button, you'll be able to schedule your strategy consult. I would recommend you just choose something in the next week. That way you have some time to process what we learned today, and then also check in with a member of our team to dig into things from there. So I'm gonna book something a little bit later so I don't take one of your guys' time slots. But from here, I'm going to schedule this.
Question already from Alexa as to whether or not the database is also useful for Canadian nonprofits.
So I will say that we are primarily serving US-based nonprofits. That said, we do have Canadian opportunities. So it's worth creating it and seeing if it works. I will tell you as a disclaimer as well, though, the bulk of our opportunities and the ones that we actively add to are US-based. And so you might see less results than others that are attending today. But a good question, Alexa. And when you're there, you're going to end up, after you've booked that time for your later check-in, you're going to end up on this page where it's let's create your first project. So when you have gotten there, it looks like Natalie gave me a complete. And so if you are done, give me a thumbs up in the chat or some sort of signal as well. Peter's saying, I can't read your form that you want filled out. How do I make it larger? Depending on the computer you're on, if you're on a Windows computer, it's going to be Control+. If you're on a Mac, it's going to be Command+. That is going to increase the size of your font in your browser. But yeah, that would be one way that you can do that. Liz is giving me a done. Sylvia's giving me a done. Awesome. I'm going to wait for a few more folks, and then we're going to start digging into creating projects together. Christopher is asking, many funders have added criteria for funding that go beyond their original purpose, diversity, social responsibility, veterans, etc. Can they be filtered out to only show results without such criteria? I will show you ways to filter down in your results in just a little bit in terms of narrowing down a little bit further on your results. Jennifer said done. Christopher gave me a done with a question mark. Well, hopefully you're in the right place there. Allison gave me a done as well. Awesome. Yeah, I can resend the link, Alexa. I'm going to do that right now. So if you missed the Zoom link earlier, just go ahead and click that link there in the Zoom link there. And we will go from there. So I'm going to wait for maybe 1 or 2 more people to be done. That way we don't get too far ahead. before we keep on trucking along. So Ellen gave us a done. Awesome.
And if anyone needs more time, they're welcome to let us know in the chat and I can kind of help them out as well.
Definitely. Awesome. So now we are good to move on. So in the case where you're still taking your time, no worries. I will be taking our time as we set up projects as well. So you'll have time to catch up. So no worries there. But the first step that I want you to do is I want you to tell us where your organization is registered. So this is where earlier we just had the question in terms of Canada. You can put in where you're based in Canada, Alexa, I think. And so in this case, I'm based in the US. So I'm going to go ahead and just imagine for a second that I am I'm going to pretend that I'm a food bank in Texas, but let's say in Texas. And so in this case, I'm just going to search for a county in Texas. Maybe I will do Clay County, Texas. And from there, click Save and Continue. On the next one, it's going to, Elizabeth, in the case where it says your account name is already taken, you might already have tried Instrumentl. So in the case where you want to reset your password, you might want to do forget your password. Otherwise, maybe try a different email and see if that works for you. In the next stage, when you are in that second stage, project overview, for project name, what I want you to do is I want you to type in a particular initiative that you might be working on. So there's two approaches. You can either name it after your organization. That's the broad-based search approach. But what I like to teach in this workshop is I like to teach getting really granular. And so I like to think about it as a particular program or area of funding I'm looking for. So in my case, I'm a food bank in Texas. Maybe I have a senior food delivery program. And so I'm going to call this Senior Food Delivery Program. You can call your project whatever you'd like. But essentially from there, you're going to select applicant type. That's going to be nonprofit. And when you're there, what you're going to want to then do is answer whether or not you want to see grants that are for faith-based organizations. So this is going to be a yes or no answer. I'm going to give you an example of what we do for both yes and no. In the case where you are faith-based, you're going to click yes, and then you're going to select your religious affiliation. What I recommend is if you are answering yes here, keep the option on both faith-based and secular. That's going to give you the most matches possible, as opposed to if you just isolate for faith-based or go secular. And then in the case where you are not faith-based, you're just going to answer no here. And then click the Save and Continue button when you're ready. And Peter is having some difficulty in the view. The other way you can do it, Peter, is in the top bar of whatever operating system you're on, you're going to have a View button. And from there, usually in the View dropdown, there's a Zoom in option. And you can also go that way in the case where your shortcuts are not working. And then when you get to that third stage on the project details, what you're going to see is you're going to see a question on which areas your project is serving. All right. So are you able to see my screen? Are you able to see my screen right now in terms of it changing? Rafi's saying that he is not, but I just want to make sure that you guys are.
No, it stayed on project details.
Okay, yeah, I'm on project details. Perfect. So we're on the right screen. Are you able to see my mouse moving right now? I'm moving my screen just to make sure.
Yes.
Okay, so it looks like we're good there then. Awesome. So we're in the right place. Everybody's in the right place. They're zooming ahead is what they are. All right, so in the which areas does your project serve? This is where you're going to want to think about where your areas of impact are in terms of your actual program. So in this case, I'm going to look into Clay County again. But maybe you'll choose a different place, or maybe you have a couple counties. What I tell folks to do is select a couple of the counties that you have impact in, because the reason why is because it's going to give you a search across a couple of your high areas of impact. So even if, for example, you support the entire state of Florida, I tell folks to select 3 to 5 counties, because it's going to go really in depth as well and be able to dig more deeply into the data when you give it into a county level. And then once you're done with selecting your areas of interest, you're going to select your fields of work. So for this, This is where I want you to think about what your organization does and think about some keywords that you often search for when you yourself are looking for grants or when you think about how to describe your work. So in my case, I am a food bank, so I'm going to search the word food. And you'll notice that immediately once I start searching for food, I see things on food access and hunger, food delivery and distribution, which directly relates to my project, and maybe some things on
yeah, it looks like we're still on project.
let me reshare my screen. Let me see if this works. Are you able to see it?
Yes, now I see the pop-up.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
Awesome. So in this case, thanks for that update, Stephen. So in that case, where we're going to do is we're going to select food safety. And what you'll essentially see is also see food security. The goal here for you as you are working through your fields of work is to identify anywhere from 3 to 7 fields of work. All right. So I want you guys to identify 3 to 7 fields of work. And the reason why I want you to do that is because it's going to give you a really nice search. If you put too many, it gets a little overwhelming. If you put too few, it keeps your results a little bit too scarce. And so I always go for 3 to 7. And in the case where you're drawing a blank right now, you're learning a lot. And so it's really hard for you to kind of think on the spot. What you can do is you just click browse all categories and then open up a particular domain area where your work might be focused in. So in this case, community and human services is probably one. And as I scroll through, I'm going to look for things and find here I have basic human needs. That's a good idea for my food bank project. I also have community services, it looks like. So now I've got 6 fields of work. And so I've got these fields of work. And from here, what I can do is I can just save that. And that's what Instrumentl is going to look at in terms of all the different opportunities and filter and prioritize for. From here, you're going to want to answer the question on whether or not you want to seek grants for agricultural producers. In my case, I'm only seeing this mainly because I selected food-related projects, but you might not see that in your case. And then you're going to get into what size grants you're looking for. If you recall earlier in our presentation, we talked about the importance of prioritization and bandwidth. So in my case, maybe I'm part of an organization where I'm the only grant writer or I'm on a small team. And so I don't want to look at grants that are less than $5,000 in terms of funding. And so I'm going to set my minimum to 5K. You do whatever works for your organization though. Maybe you'll set that to 1K. Maybe you'll set that to no minimum because you're just starting and trying to win some grants in general. Whatever it is, just think about your situation and go from there. And then when you get to what your funds will be used for, this is where I want you to think about, that first slide where I told you guys to store it in the back of your head and now call it back and essentially select what are those areas that you're going to use these funds for. So in this case, I've got project, program, and GenOp because mine is a food security project related to senior citizens. And then from here, when you are ready, click the save and exit button. And when you've done that, we're going to do that search for you. And when you've done that and you've been redirected to the matches view, I want you guys to give me another thumbs up or a done signal in the chat. That way I don't get too far ahead before we keep on moving along. Awesome, Liz is done. And if Liz is done, then this means that you've seen this magical screen, which always causes a lot of joy for people, because essentially what this shows you is that for my senior food delivery program, Instrumentl has found 191 grant opportunities for me. Awesome, looks like everyone's following along really well. That's great. So if you click that Let's Go button, I want to go over what you're looking at in your screen here. So you are in your Matches tab. And what your Matches tab is I want you to imagine that somebody made a tool that pretty much was like an email inbox just for grants. That's what this is. So your Matches tab is essentially a personalized inbox of grant opportunities for your nonprofit. And you can actually make tons of these. So we made one project today, but you can actually make more than one project on Instrumentl and set up for different program areas. So going back to my tutoring program that I volunteer for, I could create one for the reading program. I could create one for the math program. I could create one for the science program and have 3 separate independent searches all working for me at the same time. So essentially this Matches tab, the first tab you're going to be on is the Opportunity Matches tab. And this is essentially going to be active grant opportunities that you can start working on. This means that the funder has a website and they are accepting applications. The first thing I want to draw your attention to is the drop downs, best match and filter. The left-hand one is going to give you options like filtering based off of deadline, amount, and newness. For everybody here in the room, I ask that you keep it on best match because that means it's going to prioritize it by the matching algorithm. But as you guys continue to play around with your accounts for the next 2 weeks, if you feel so adventurous, you can definitely start to sort things by newness or by deadline, because sometimes people find it useful. For example, if today we're December 21st and you're just trying to crank something out before the new year, maybe you're going to filter by deadline and see that you've got some opportunities you could crank out right before the end of the year. So that would be the use case application of organizing it by deadline. But otherwise, when you keep it in best match, it keeps things nice and organized for you. The next thing in dropdown, this will answer one of the earlier questions. I think it was from Christopher, but essentially he was asking about like how to filter out for particular things. So some of the advanced filters in Instrumentl is you can actually filter by different funding uses as well as funder types. So if, for example, I know that my organization thrives when it comes to private opportunities because we're just really kind of the sweet spot for private foundations, I can filter for private opportunities from all the matches as well. The other thing I can do to speak more to Christopher's question about filtering out for particular things is I can use this search bar to the right of the word filter and search for particular phrases. So again, my project is a senior food delivery project. So maybe I just want to search for the word senior. And what you'll see is that from the 191 initial matches, here are the 11 that specifically have some sort of reference to senior in the actual grant opportunity itself. And so what you can do is you can always use these different features at the top here to help you work down on this list. Sometimes people feel a little overwhelmed when they initially see how many results there are, but there's always ways you can parse it and cut it up into more digestible pieces. And so that's one big tip that I tell you. But the other thing that I want you to do is I essentially want you to look through what you're seeing in your matches here. And in the case where you set up your project well, you should see opportunities you are familiar with as well as opportunities you are not familiar with. If you see that situation, then it means you've set up your project really well. In the case where you're seeing not that situation, then what I recommend you do is go back to the top right to edit project and play around with your fields of work later on. You don't have to do it right now, but in generally speaking, people that have set up a good project will see a combination of opportunities they are aware of, as well as new good fit funders that they can start pursuing. And if you have any questions about how to set up your project and things like that, that's what that strategy consult time is for. You can feel free to ask questions, get your own situation evaluated by somebody on our team and whatnot. But essentially from here, this is where you're going to see all the information about these opportunities and the reason why we're showing it to you. So in this case, I've got this targeted small grants program. It's from the reinvestment fund, and it is being shown to me because it matches my grant amount criteria of at least 5K. It's 20K to 200K in funding. And I can see fields of work, food access and hunger, an exact match, right? And it matches as well nonprofit and applicant type, as well as the location of my project in the United States. And so it looks like in this situation, Sylvia's actually found one that she submitted this morning. That's awesome. And so from here, what you'll see is you'll see details as to what the funder is looking for. So you can see what you're looking through as you're going through these results is you're thinking back to earlier in the presentation. We thought about those 16 questions to evaluate good fit funders. I'm just thinking about some of the high level questions. I don't need it to be an exact science right now because we're in this workshop, but what I'm looking for are things like, is there alignment in terms of eligibility requirements? We answered that question as a resounding yes, because we went over this top section. And then what I'm also looking at is what exactly are the goals of this organization? So what I might look at is I can see that this is the Rural Investment Fund, and they are focusing on supporting innovative fresh food, retail, and food system enterprise to improve access to healthy food in underserved areas through food retail. And then I'm going to search as well. There's no mention exactly to senior, but at the same time, you will see that there is information about different capital needs and things like that. And so in general, I think this is probably going to be a good fit. And so if in the case where you find something interesting, click the save button at the bottom, and then you'll be able to save that and change the status later on as well if you would like. And so from here, you're going to go ahead and save that, and then that will go into your tracker. So same thing as you're working through your own matches, what I want you to look at is I want you to take a high level glance through and look for opportunities that might be worth your while to check out later on, and then save it with a note or save it to your tracker. And then we'll go into the tracker side of things. And as you work your way through, I'm going to try to show you a few examples of what you'll start to see in terms of some of the some of the different results here as well. So here you'll see the J.W. Couch Foundation grant. And what you'll notice is that when Instrumentl can parse the 990 report of a funder, we're going to give you this section called the 990 snapshot. And this is going to be where we're going to summarize for you high-level information about that funder. So you can see here, this funder, the median grant amount is $50K. That's really good for my project because in my case, I was setting my minimum for $5K. So it'd be fantastic if I were to pursue funding from these guys. But what I can also do is I can actually go ahead and click View 990 Report. And so from here, this is where that magic comes in terms of, I pulled that example from the New York Community Trust earlier, but now we see it actually in action where I'm seeing things like average grant amount, median grant amount, total giving from this foundation. I'm even seeing key people. I'm seeing things like key financial stats. So in the case where I want to identify giving averages as well as medians, what I can do is I can see what the trend is looking like. And I can also even see things like what the grant ranges have been. So you can see here, 47 awards in the last 3 years, and the median is coming in at 50 grand. That said, there are some grants in the lower end, but what's really cool about this is Instrumentl is summarizing this data for me, as opposed to me having to scroll through pages and pages of 990 reports to find this information myself, right? And so this is really helpful because it helps me answer my questions faster. So here you can see this map of the US. I'm based, again, for this example project, I'm a diaper bank in Texas. I can immediately see that Texas is an area of focus for this funder. If I want to filter down even further, I can just look for Texas. And from here, I can see who exactly is getting funded within the state of Texas. And so this is really cool because it essentially helps me get closer to that question of, are they a good funder? Are they not a good funder? How do I know? And these are the sorts of things that you'll want to evaluate as you're working through this. You'll also see sections like this, in which I talked about the importance of knowing how much are new grantees getting versus repeat grantees. So what does this tell me? Well, it tells me that if I were to actually pursue this grant opportunity, I might expect a higher grant amount my first year, but it might actually be less if they were to renew with me, right? And that'll change the calculus as to how I'm going to prioritize this later on and whatnot in terms of future renewals and whatnot. But what you'll also see is that when you look at the grant sizes, you'll see how the bulk of situations are coming in from new grantees, right? And so this is great because it means that they're potentially open to new relationships. And then lastly, we talked about that question about giving by NTEE code. That's something that Instrumentl also helps you take care of. So in this case, what I can see is, again, I'm a food delivery program for senior citizens, but what I notice is that human services, which is probably more closely related to the food delivery side of things, is in the top 5 focus areas of what they're giving the most money to. That said, it's not nearly as much as education. So this funder really cares about education, and I can tell that right here. But let's say, for example, I wanted to dig even deeper. I'm not satisfied with this level of data. I want to dig even deeper. So if I want to do that, I can scroll down and I can actually expand into each of these sections. So I can see exactly in human services what exactly they are funding. So in this case, they're funding residential care and adult day programs, human service organizations, as well as group homes. So based off this, I haven't seen much there, but maybe there's something in food, agriculture, nutrition. Now I can see that in here, there's food banks. That's where I would fall under. They've given 125K, average grant has been 25K, median grant has been 25K, and then there's also some food programs. So I see a little bit of emphasis there, but you'll notice how far down my actual area of focus is. It's not in the top 5. And so in this case, if I'm evaluating this funder, it might be interesting to me, but it might also not be interesting to me. So this is something where I would probably leave a note for myself and say, review further at weekly team meeting, right? Because this is something where it's not nearly as clear of a home run from what we looked at. But what's really cool is we did all of that due diligence pretty much in the last 2 minutes, right? I'll show you the older way you can do this in terms of the old school methods you do this. So the way you would do this in an old school method is you would actually open up one of these 990 reports and you would just scroll through this stuff. And I don't know about you, but I can't do this. I just can't. I don't have the patience for it. But this is something in which it's often not searchable either. And so it's really difficult to find that information. So what I want you guys to do is save a couple matches there. And then I'm going to dig into what the funder matches tab is. And then we're going to dig into the tracker. And then we're going to see if folks have some questions we can answer and things like that. But essentially what's going to happen is every single week now that you have your project set in place, Instrumentl is going to keep an eye out for new opportunities for your project. So I'm going to reshare my screen. That way you can see you can see this project. So do you see my other screen now in terms of the air quality? Are you guys following right now? Does it say air quality?
Nope. It says tracker matches. I'm looking at the Honda USA Foundation Environment Award.
Okay, let me reshare my screen then. Let's do it again. How about now? Do you see air quality in the top
yes,
left?
air quality
Awesome.
up at the top.
Awesome. So when you set up your matches on Instrumentl, we are going to always be looking out for you. So what you can see in this example account of mine is I've got an air quality project and I've got 4 new grants that have been matched for me. So I have not visited this account for a while, but essentially Instrumentl always has my back and is looking for new opportunities that meet the search criteria that I set in place ages ago for this. It can also do it for all sorts of other projects. So you can see I have a homeless and elderly project. I've got a homeless shelter project. I've got Liz's awesome project. I've got mental health and all this stuff, right? And so essentially this really shows you the power of bringing everything into a single source of truth. Because if you have a nonprofit where you're working on 3 or 4 different initiatives, it can get super exhausting to keep manually updating, everything yourself or doing new searches for every single new program. Whereas in Instrumentl, everything gets housed into this concept of a project where you have a dedicated workspace with a saved grant search as well as a tracker. And we'll dig into the tracker in just a little bit. But what I want to dig into next is the funder matches section. So the funder matches section is really cool because essentially this is actually going to look through funders that may not even have websites, may be invite only, and essentially don't have an active grant opportunity, but we think they might be worth your while to building relationships with in the longer term because of their funding history. So in the case where you ever forget over the next 2 weeks what the definitions of both opportunity matches and funder matches are, there is a nice little helper text here. You can just click that guy and it'll define it for you. But again, like I just said, a funder match refers to a funder that submits 990s or doesn't have a website or an open way to apply for an LOI. So what we're doing is we're parsing through their data and we are essentially trying to show you other good fit funders you may not be aware of. That way you can add to your shortlist. So when it comes to priority from today, definitely start with your opportunity matches, what we just went over. But if you really exhaust those, feel free to check out the funder matches section because that's going to give you another list of good fit funders to pursue. So in this case, I've kind of shifted gears. I'm now in this air quality project. I'm actually going to go back to this one instead because I think it's food security, which is closer to what my original project was. But essentially what you'll see is you're going to see exactly why we are showing this to you in the funder matches section. So the Schwab Charitable Fund has given to things around food access and hunger, food delivery and distribution services and things like that. You're going to see all sorts of information about the foundation here, multi-year trends. I can see it's trending up in terms of the average. And essentially, if I scroll all the way down, I can see that beautiful section in terms of what they're funding the most. I don't see that much in terms of food and stuff. So I'm going to move on to the next one. So in the case where you find something that's not a good fit, you can always hide from this project and that will take it away from your results. But essentially from here, I'm just going to continue working my way through these. And what I can see right off the bat is this one's a little bit higher in the list. So maybe it's worth pursuing. I have food, agriculture, and nutrition. You can see that food banks, they received $290K in funding. It's kind of smaller though, relative to everything else. So maybe I'm going to look for a better fit. And essentially I can just go through these matches really quickly because all the data is parsed for me. So this is just a really fast way for me to start digging into things. I can search for things like food in the search bar as well. And you can see this is actually funding a ton of food banks and things like that. So this is definitely potentially someone interesting to me. And then what I can see is I can see that in this situation, we are looking at a lot of repeat grantees. So it might be a little bit harder for me to break into this new funder. But essentially what this funder matches tab is going to be for, it's good for you to create another short list of opportunities. That way you can work on those in terms of longer term relationship building. So going back to that earlier slide on building a system that works for you, this is what you do once you exhaust all the active opportunities you're working on, is you start to establish relationships with these folks that don't have an application ready for you today, because when you're on the short list, it means that you're going to be able to flip the switch and go from there. We are much more powerful than GrantWatch actually, and we are a lot easier to use actually. So what we like to say is you can learn Instrumentl in less than an hour, which we've been covering it for maybe 30 minutes, 20 minutes or so. And so that just goes to show you the difference. But also there is a comparison page. If you just search GrantWatch versus Instrumentl, there is a comparison page where you can see the different features of what we do versus what GrantWatch does in the case where you're exploring us. But the next thing I want to go over is the tracker. The tracker is really cool. And I think a lot of people will kind of have this synapse connect in their head in terms of like how it all comes together. And this is the tracker that every single project's going to have. So if you followed along with me at this point, you should have saved 1 or 2 opportunities. And what you're going to have is a tracker. So if you go ahead and go into your project and click tracker, you're going to see something like this. It might be a little bit less complete, but in this case, I've got 19 opportunities that I'm working on. And what's really cool about this tracker is I can actually filter by year. I can also change my fiscal year in the case where I run off a different cycle than just the standard calendar year. And I can also add opportunities that I'm individually working on, as well as upload an existing Google Sheet or Excel tracker that your team might already use. So if you want to bring your work into Instrumentl, you can do so really easily with our template. What's going to happen is once you bring it all into Instrumentl, you're going to unlock a whole nother world of collaboration, because essentially, if you click into these opportunities, you're going to see that you can actually do a lot of things within this tracker. You can do things like leave notes for yourself. You can go ahead and duplicate it for another year or change the year you're working on it for. You can also even change things like tracking how much you've requested and how much you've won. And you can even create tasks for yourself. So this is really good for the EDs in the room when it comes to delegation across your team. So if you have somebody that's in charge of reporting, you can say, send the report, set the deadline. Instead of emailing everyone, I can actually just say, Alex, you're actually in charge of this, and just send it to Alex, and Alex will get that message, right? And the last thing you can do is you can upload all of your proposals in the same place. Here's why this is so powerful. Let's say you deal with turnover in your team. Doesn't matter. In Instrumentl, everything is in the same place. You just have your team log in from there. And from there, you'll be able to take a look at that. We do have a comparison to Foundation Search. When you are going onto our website, it's going to be in the footer section. Just click Foundation Search and you will similarly see the differences between us and Foundation Search. We are not only cheaper, but we also just do more in terms of functionality there. So great questions coming in as well. I'll leave links as well for you guys in the chat. That way you don't have to go searching for it. I'll leave links for both of you guys here. So that's that link and that's that link. And then the other thing that's cool about this tracker is you can generate reports. You won't be able to do it on your free accounts, but I just want to show you an example. If I will have a big team meeting or a board of directors meeting coming up and I need to send something off beforehand, I can quickly pull reports in pretty much any project I'm working on. I can change the status or choose all statuses, choose the years that I want to generate that report. And I've got a PDF or a CSV report at my fingertips ready for my team. This is super powerful in the case where you ever want to do just like monthly recaps as to where your grant seeking efforts are at, or you want to send a list off to your board of opportunities you've researched and you want to say, hey, do you have any existing connections to these folks and whatnot? So that is super helpful as well. And then the other thing that's really cool about our tracker is this researching tab. It auto rolls deadlines for you. So in the case where you have added a search for, or you've saved an opportunity into this researching tab from your active opportunities, what's going to happen is we're going to automatically track these funder deadlines for you. So if March 18th, 2022 comes around and I still have not started to move this New York Community Trust opportunity to another stage, we're going to automatically roll that to the 2023 date. And so what that means is theoretically, this researching tab is always another short list of new next up good fit funders that you can start working on. And that's really where people start to see outcomes in terms of applying for more grants consistently. The last thing I'll go over with you guys today is I'm going to go over the quick find as well as how to invite some team members in the case where you guys have some friends that are not here in this workshop today, and you can tell them that they missed out. But essentially in the top left in the quick find, you can use this and search by EIN or by name, and then essentially find the background funder or recipient profile of an organization. So how I tell folks to use this in this workshop is look up keyword phrases that are similar to your organization's impact, or look up similar organizations to yours. And then essentially what you will be able to find is you will be able to find who is funding them. So that actual tutoring program I've been using as an example today is called Tutoring Chicago. I'm going to look up Tutoring Chicago. I can pull them up. And what you'll see is when I go to their recipient profile and I scroll on down, there's this cool section called Past Awards Received. And essentially what Instrumentl lets you see is it allows you to reverse search nonprofits similar to yours and shows you who is funding them. So now I see who has been funding nonprofits tutoring Chicago. So if I were an after-school tutoring program that is also based in Chicago, but I don't have all that many relationships and grants, I can use this as another short list of good fit funders to immediately start working on. So that is another great way for you to add things in place. All right. So that is a really helpful thing. Sylvia had a question on, can you track metrics and deliverables after the grant is awarded? In general, right now, most of our reporting things are going to come in the form of a reporting task. That said, if you have other ideas as to what you would like to see, you are welcome to chat it into this bubble, and our product team will definitely consider it in terms of future things. When funders change their criteria or fund offerings, how are those changes propagated in Instrumentl application immediately or periodically? Essentially what happens is we have web trackers on every single one of these funders that are in opportunity matches, and our content team reviews any of the changes. So we first confirm the change actually is legitimate, and then from there we update it in our system. And our content team is a full-time team, so they're essentially working on this on a daily basis throughout the weekdays. So if you ever have an issue though with a particular situation, what you can do is within an opportunity, you have this alert button and you can click suggest an update and you can send us your feedback and we'll also look at it from there. I'm going to wrap up our presentation, and then from there, I'm going to dig into next steps. I'm going to dig into freebies for everybody since everybody's been so attentive today, and then we'll go from there. So let's go ahead and jump back into the presentation. Let me know if you see the presentation. My screen share has been a little funky. So if you see the presentation right now, shoot me a thumbs up or a yes or something in the chat. That way I just know before I keep on going. Awesome. Sally, thank you so much for that. And so from here, what we're going to do is we're going to dig into learning takeaways. Before we do that though, in the case where you skipped that strategy consult earlier when you were creating your call, if you do want time with our team is more than happy to just look over your project and essentially review, make sure you got everything right. I know that sometimes in these virtual environments, it's hard for me to not be able to see your screen and whatnot. So feel free to use that link in the case where you skipped that earlier and you want to get a time with our team. We're always available for you. We also have that chat bubble in the bottom right that you can always chat in on if you have any questions in the next 2 weeks. But 3 key learning takeaways from today. First learning takeaway, grants are a great way to diversify your funding. If we haven't made it abundantly clear, there's an opportunity out there for you. And if this didn't convince you, I don't know what will, because there are just hundreds of opportunities and it looks like a ton of folks have been able to find some good ones. So it's great to hear there. The second learning takeaway is follow the 5 steps we reviewed today to prepare for grants. It is so important for you to think about all of those questions we went over today, but also just take the small steps to actually prepare your organization in the case where you are not yet ready. Emily shared some helpful resources from Elevation as well. And so just make sure that when you are on your website, that first step was, is it clear what you guys are doing in terms of your mission as well as your impact? And then from there, follow the other steps in terms of framing your programs as projects and just work through all the different things that we went over today in terms of the decision matrices. And then lastly, you can feel free to use Instrumentl to turbocharge your grants and feel free to join us for more free grant trainings. This is very much a broad-based approach workshop, but I run more detailed workshops on a regular basis and we run them all for free as well. And so in the case where you're looking to level up your grant skills and whatnot, we're always happy to help you. You can also go on YouTube and search Instrumentl workshops and you'll find pretty much like 15 or 20 hours of workshops there. So feel free to check those out. They're completely free for you. And feel free to also check those out on our blog where we'll have those housed. If you want to follow up with me, my email is will@instrumentl.com. You can save $100 off, by the way, for your first month with the code Elevation100, courtesy of Elevation there. And yeah, so you'll have the next 2 weeks. So if Instrumentl is a good fit for you, definitely use that code because Elevation has hooked you guys up with that. And then